It is 2nd of August. In one of the barracks in which we had to live in recent months, I came across a pile of old newspapers. They were newspapers where from the beginnings of 1990s, that is from the first year of Ukraine's independence until 2010s. In the evenings in my spare time, I read these newspapers with interest and little by little painted a picture for myself of how we ended up where we are now. First of all, about 90% of all old newspapers were printed in Russian. To a large extent, this is a relic of Soviet times when only local newspapers of little importance were printed in the languages of the national republics, and all central important publications were printed in Russian. I want to say that this situation persisted until recent years. Even in 2020, most printed publications were published in Russian, and only a few months before the full scale invasion, newspapers and magazines began to switch to Ukrainian en masse. The second thing I noticed was that Russian news received almost as much attention as Ukrainian news. Newspapers necessarily reported on all of Putin's foreign visits, the progress of reforms in Russia, and the war in Chechnya. Moreover, Russian officials or government information agencies were almost always the only source of information. More often than not, newspapers simply reprinted Russian articles without adding anything to them at all. That is, Ukraine was immersed in the information space of Russia, and so it went on for decades. Moreover, for years, there were parties in power that were either openly pro Russian or worse, that tried to rebuild good relations with both Russia and the West at the same time. Was politicians who talked about a possible threat from Moscow, was who warned about a possible attack by the Russians were marginal, they were laughed at in editorials. The same editorials justified the reduction of the Ukrainian army. Editors and politicians wrote that Ukraine has no enemies, that there are treaties of friendship and cooperation with all its neighbors, that the existence of its own army makes almost no sense. If an unexpected event happens and someone attacks Ukraine, the country will quickly be saved by Russia. The idea that Russia could attack didn't really occur to politicians and publishers, well, almost did not occur. In a couple of newspapers in 2008, when Russia occupied part of Georgia, there were warnings that Ukraine would be next victim of Russian aggression. However, most media at that time took Russia's side, blaming the small Georgia for somehow misbehaving and, as a result, losing 20% of its territory. Once again, for years, Russians were portrayed in the media as brothers, reliable partners, and even defenders. Those who warned about the threat from Russia were depicted as either crazy or ignorant of the modern world. So it's not surprising that Ukrainians were bewildered when Russians seized Crimea and unleashed the war in Donbass in 2014. Most Ukrainians simply could not believe the reality of what was happening. They could not believe that so-called brothers and defenders would turn out to be aggressors and killers. Ukraine is now paying a heavy price for these illusions. The myth of fraternal nations collapsed and buried many of Ukraine's best sons and daughters under it, and those who built this myth, unfortunately, are still unpunished.